man whose intelligence and whose expertise more generally, and whose status as an international statesman of the first order makes him very important for our understanding of a part of the world that we try to focus on at Secure Freedom Radio, but too few of us are paying close attention to. That would be Latin America, what some have rather contemptuously dismissed as our backyard. It's our front yard, at the very least. It's our intimate neighborhood. And what Francisco Tudela, the former first vice president of Peru, also that country's foreign minister and UN ambassador, has to share with us about what is happening to his country at the moment and what it portends not just for his countrymen, but also for our hemisphere more generally and for us here in the United States, is of really the utmost importance. And we so appreciate his visits with us, updating us on developments in Peru and again throughout the region, and what they will mean in due course, especially if we are inattentive to them. And I also want to say he is the author of a new paper published earlier this week by the Center for Security Policy, a white paper about the new government of Peru's threat to the Western Hemisphere. It's a great pleasure to have him back. Mr. Vice President, thank you so much for joining us once again here at Secure Freedom Radio.
Good morning, Frank. I'm delighted to be with you.
We are going to talk about a number of things, as we usually do with you, but I think it's always important to sort of level set for our audience about what has happened in Peru recently and the implications of it, as I said, not just for the people of Peru, but for neighboring states, notably Chile, which has just seemingly followed the lead of Peru recently in its election of a rabid communist to run that government. And we'll talk a little bit about where this goes from here, but just give us a sense of, since we last talked, sir, what has happened with respect to the communist takeover of Peru, going back to the election in the summer last year?
Well, what happened is that we have elected a far-left president, Mr. Pedro Castillo, whose party, Peru Libre, is a Marxist, Leninist, Maoist party in its statutes. And they won the election due to the huge frustration that the COVID-19 very badly managed in Peru had created. And the narrative of the last 20 years that was dominated by what in the US is known as the champagne left, and we call the caviar left. That is the left-wing progressivists that want capitalism to profit from it, but at the same time, they send a very aggressive anti-establishment and, in fact, anti-capitalist message. And the third factor was fraud. And when the evidences of fraud were sent to the electoral jury didn't want to go into the merits of the case. That combination of factors brought this communist government. But I have to add that also the negligence of two US administrations, because Latin America had been extremely important to US policy until the Clinton administration. But then, after the fall of the Soviet Union and apparently the end of communism, the administrations of George W. Bush and Barack Obama forgot everything about Latin America and abandoned Latin America to itself. So that's 16 years. And so the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, and the native communists, creating an international movement called the Foro de Sao Paulo, and then a kind of elite group of socialist leaders called the Grupo de Puebla, managed to create a Marxist structure, a neo-Marxist, because formally they have abandoned armed struggles, so they don't follow Marx on that, and they have Gramscian politics, so they try to dominate the culture, and they are not interested in the proletariat anymore, but on minorities, even sexual or indigenous or whatever. And the fact is that this narrative, with all these frustrations, brought as end result a real communist government to Peru.
Yes. And this is a very rich table you've set, and there are several things that I'd like to just quickly drill down with you on, because I think it's important to understanding what this means, again, for both our hemisphere and for the United States, that we understand the forces at work. So you're talking about clearly conditions that apply not just to Peru, but to others throughout the region, notably economic difficulties, the COVID phenomenon, and the seductive appeal of, well, what's come to be called free stuff that the socialists or the leftists or the communists have on offer. You've talked also about the Forum of Sao Paulo, and I'd like you to sort of drill down a bit more on that. And in particular, Mr. Vice President, the extent to which these indigenous leftists in that forum are really being played or run or certainly controlled by foreign leftists, notably the Chinese Communist Party, in that forum and beyond.
Yes, we have three concentric circles. The first circle is the national communist parties. In Peru, there are around 10, and Peru Libre is one of them. The second circle is...
And that's Castillo's party, Peru Libre.
Yes, the government party is among those communist parties. Then you have this fifth communist international, because the Trotskyist disappeared now as the fourth. This is the fifth international communist international, and it is extended all over Latin America and Spain. You have 124 communist parties of different kinds affiliated to that movement. Originally, before Lula was elected, because he invented this in Brazil with Fidel Castro, you have terrorist movements in the Forum of Sao Paulo, but they have been set aside discreetly. You had the FARC, you have the Tupac Amaru revolutionary movement, those were terrorist movements. And now you have many governments in Latin America affiliated to the agenda of the forum. Anyone can see that agenda. You go to Google, you put forodesaopaulo.org, and you can read the basic tenets of the forum that are being applied now in Mexico, Nicaragua, in Venezuela, in Bolivia, in Argentina by the governments, in Peru, and it will be applied by Chile.
So, and these are fundamentally the tenets of well, as you call it, neo-Marxism, full on. Is that right?
And it has a nationalist, indigenous element that Orthodox Marxists during the Cold War didn't have. And the CEO of this movement, of course, is Cuba. And they are the chief executive officers for Latin America. But behind Cuba and its operators all over the Western Hemisphere, you have Russia, China, and Iran. in the case of Venezuela, it's not only the presence of Hezbollah, it's the presence of the Iranian government itself. They have built ammunition factories, etc. in Venezuela. In the case of Ecuador, Ecuador is indebted up to the neck with the Chinese. They gave very attractive, soft loans until they couldn't pay.
We call them payday loans here in the United States. Yeah, this Belt and Road Initiative, and unfortunately, it's of course not just in Ecuador. You are also now a target of all of that with Peru, and in that regard, again, in the context of the dominant influence that we're now seeing emerge from China and some of these other powers that are basically its partners and proxies, of a certain neo-colonial quality to it as well. In that regard, talk, if you would, about this port, perhaps even two ports, mega ports that the Chinese are now in the process of bringing to bear in Western Peru.
Well, it's a mega port. It's the first port they are building in Latin America. They have a majority stock in that port. The fact is they take the decisions. All the construction, security, and subcontractors of that port are Chinese. So there are there is not a strong Peruvian presence except in very subordinate levels.
Yeah. And this is, by the way, the standard operating procedure, I think, for the Belt and Road Initiative.
It's the first time they built a port of this magnitude in Latin America. They have never built a port in Latin America. It's the first one. Why? Because it's in the western coast, in the South Pacific. It's in the normal area of expansion. Once they will be able to have a well-structured fleet that will support the commercial lines, and they can project to the whole of Latin America. Peru, in the words of the Chinese ambassadors and authorities, will be the hub for Latin America. So it's the elected point of entry to Latin America. But at the same time, if you go to the southern port of Hilo in Peru and follow the parallel, you will end in Darwin. That's the northern port of Australia. So in the confluence of the southwestern Pacific and the Indian Ocean and the North Pacific in general,
Panama Canal.
You don't have nothing in between Australia and South America. And so the Chinese are setting their foot here first. I make this analogy. The East India Company had a merchant fleet, and the Royal Navy was developed as a follow-up to the British merchant fleet.
Yes.
And they had points of support like Ascension Island, Gibraltar, the Falklands.
Diego Garcia, ultimately.
Diego Garcia, etc. Now the Wall Street Journal a few days ago has given the news that they have acquired a base in Guinea. That is
Equatorial Guinea, yeah.
Equatorial Guinea, that's the Eastern Atlantic. What are the Chinese doing in the Eastern Atlantic?
Yeah.
They have in the Bay of Bengal the Cocos Islands that belong to Myanmar. Myanmar will never be a democracy because behind the military junta, what you have is the Chinese, and that is why all attempts to establish democracy in Myanmar have failed. Well, now they are managing the Panama Canal, but that is still a sovereign institution of Panama. In the case of Peru,
for the moment, but effectively they can alter that at any moment at will.
But we are building this huge base with a mold that is 400 meters long, 27 meters wide, in an L form. It has a concrete hardened tunnel of more than 1 mile, through which they are discussing that if it will be a road or a railroad, will run through that, not to bother the population of Shanghai, that at most must have, let's say, 30,000 people. So it's very strange to have, let's say, opted for that formula in the name of ecology.
Yeah, and the point I think you're getting at here is
that it would be used by the superposed Panamax E3 ships. Yeah. But at the same time, there is the possibility that in the future, once the fleet is strengthened, they are building these aircraft carriers every 2 years. Once that fleet is strengthened, you could have a Navy carrier strike, Chinese Navy carrier strike force,
yes,
with all the logistics they need in this port, in the rear guard of the pivot of Asia strategy that the US has adopted vis-a-vis China in the North Pacific.
Well, we can reflect on how real that pivot to Asia has proven to be, but I think your point is exceedingly well taken. It doesn't matter. Whatever we're trying to do there or will have to do in the future, it's going to be undermined by this arrangement. And going back to your point about the East India Company, model that gave rise to and then wound up working hand in glove with the Royal Navy of Britain. This is an inherently dual-use project, this Belt and Road Initiative, colonial infrastructure build-out, is it not? Not just, again, in Peru, but in Equatorial Guinea and all of the other places that you mentioned.
In the case of Africa, 700 Chinese corporations control the economic life of Africa. That's the truth. And they have every year, every 2 years, as a Sino-African summit in Beijing, where all the presidents of Africa go. And they are doing now that. They profited from the war in Iraq in 2003 to get into Africa, and the West couldn't do nothing because the West had the hands tied in Afghanistan and Iraq and was distracted in the Middle East.
So I have been told, Mr. Vice President, that there is actually at this point only really one country in the whole of Africa, and that is Morocco, that has resisted the Chinese efforts to penetrate and, well, subvert, but certainly dominate these nations with these payday loan, arrangements and the build out of infrastructure. You have some personal insights into Morocco and neighboring Algeria, and interestingly enough, the Chinese are very much apparently engaged in ramping up hostilities between those two countries. Give us a little bit of the background and how the Castillo government is, interestingly enough, playing in that mix.
Well, in December 2020, the US recognized Moroccan sovereignty over the Western Sahara. For the United Nations, it's a different story, but it's it's a territory whose destiny has still to be defined. But Algiers protects what is called the Saharawi Republic. It's a Marxist republic that in fact operates in Sinduf in Algeria, but waged a guerrilla war against Morocco in the Western Sahara. The idea behind that is to have access to the Atlantic and override the position of Morocco as a point of entry of the West to Africa, and to build a port in the Western Sahara that would have the same characteristics as the Peruvian one in Shanghai. Well, Algiers and Morocco a few months ago broke diplomatic relations. 15 days after those countries broke diplomatic relations, Peru recognized the Saharawi Arab Democratic Republic, that is this Marxist entity that is a cover-up for the guerrillas of the Polisario Front, and that they operate from Algiers. So Peru took position. Now, Algiers is a traditional ally of Russia, and Morocco is a traditional ally of the US. And in this conflict, that is a conflict of entity for the African coast of the Atlantic Ocean, Peru has taken sides.
Yeah, and the Chinese have as well.
With the Russians, the Chinese.
Probably no accident there that the Peruvians have done as the Chinese wish.
This is deliberate. President Castillo, the first thing he did, he received the visits of different ambassadors, even the US ambassador when he won the elections. But he took the care of going to me. He did a visit before taking office with the press to the Chinese embassy to pay his respects. And he said that Peru and China have a fundamental strategic relationship. So we cannot close our eyes and see this as the classic picturesque Latin American politics with a guy with a sombrero running around. That's good for comics. But here we have a real danger, because behind the sombrero you have powerful powers that are against the United States, against free market, and against free trade and liberalism in Latin America.
And freedom, more generally. And you mentioned the sombrero. Of course, that's the trademark brand of Pedro Castillo to demonstrate his lineage as a peasant kind of teacher.
Peru in the last 25 years, a success story. We don't have a substantial foreign debt. We've had a steady growth that never went below 6% all these years. To have elected a communist government that is destroying the economy. This destroys the economy. There is a absolute lack of trust and confidence in the Peruvian economy. Capitals have fled from Peru. There are no new investments. There is no foreign investment now. It's a very complex situation that is already tensing the internal economy of Peru. And so to have changed so abruptly of sides is a huge problem for us Peruvians.
Certainly is. And the question I want to turn to, and we've only got a couple of minutes left now, unfortunately, Mr. Vice President, is it's a huge problem for the United States as well. In your paper, and I commend it to people, they can find it at securefreedom.org, the Center for Security Policy's website. It's a white paper by our guest, the Honorable Francisco Tudela, entitled, I believe, the new Peruvian government's threat to the Western Hemisphere. Talk about what the specific dangers are for the United States of not just what's happening in Peru, but as a template for what could happen going forward, certainly, as you say, in Chile most immediately, but perhaps in Colombia and Brazil as well.
Well, what has happened in Chile is a tragedy, because Chile was the super success story of Latin America, as was the case of Peru. But of course, they have 4 times our national income. It is really a success story. And there was what was called the Bolivarian breeze, that is, agents from the Cuban G2, from the Venezuelans, fermented 2 years ago, huge, violent demonstrations, not only against the government, but against the churches. They even burned a church in Santiago, against
Chile.
establishment. They were very anarchical, very
But
far.
Mr. Vice President, if I may just interrupt you because we're almost out of time. Just quickly, you've indicated that there are three specific areas that are of concern or should be to the United States and its people about these developments in the region. Could you just cover those quickly?
Chile has fallen to the far left due to a destabilization policy of the Forum of Sao Paulo. Colombia in May next year is in danger of falling also.
This year now, unfortunately.
This year now, yes, you are right.
The new year.
In a few months, Colombia and Brazil will hold elections. And if they fall, the whole continent becomes a platform in which not only these socialist policies will be developed and the whole continent will be impoverished, and you will have migrations and millions of Latin Americans fleeing the continent, but also it will become a platform.
Many of them seeking to come here, is your point.
But of course, where else would you go?
Yeah.
The US is the land of the free. People that want to build a future and cut with the past, what they desire most is to go to the US. I think there is even a study about that.
Mm-hmm.
Around
there's a number of them.
5 billion people want to go to the US around the world.
Yeah. Of course, and at the moment, it's the door's wide open to them to do so.
So it's very important for the US to understand that these countries have to be viable countries with working economies that give jobs to the people and have working democracies. Because
don't have hostile powers trying to dominate them, dangerous for us and destabilizing the region, and don't promote drug trafficking, which is another problem. Mr. Vice President, just in the minute or two we have left, what should Americans be urging our government to do at this moment to try to stave off the possibility that the communists who've taken your country recently and now taken Chile are prevented from running the table in Colombia and Brazil?
Even if the policy of the US seems to be following the script of the Obama administration and the George W. Bush administrations, the fact is that the State Department and the American government must be aware that they must support the democratic forces and the civil societies of Latin America in the battle for freedom.
Amen. This is vital, and I hope that your admonitions are going to be heeded. We're certainly going to do everything we can to make sure that the American people are aware of them, and we appreciate so much your time. Mr. Vice President, you appeared on our Securing America program on television last week, and of course this appearance, and we're hoping next week to have you back for another webinar. We did one that was very important and unfortunately quite prescient about what was likely to happen in Chile shortly before the election there. We're going to take stock with you and hopefully a few of our other colleagues in our hemispheric security initiative to understand and address now, before it's too late, the possibilities that the hemisphere may well go entirely into what I call a no-go zone for not just the United States, but for freedom as well. Vice President Francisco Tudela, thank you for your time today, sir. Come back to us again, sir, very soon. And in the meantime, stay well and safe. And
thank you very much
for all your work. Next up, we'll speak with another very close student of communists and their subversive and dangerous agenda, Trevor Loudon, a man who has, among other things, just contributed an important new film, Enemies Within the Church. We'll talk to them about all of that and more straight ahead.